No one left White City. Those who tried vanished. And somehow, Silas Kane had come back.
The room reeked of oil, sweat, and rust. The stale air hung thick, suffocating in the dim glow of the single bulb that swayed above. Its faint flicker carved sharp, dancing shadows across the cracked concrete walls, making them seem alive. Silas Kane sat slumped in the center of the room, his arms lashed tightly behind a rusted chair that wobbled with the slightest movement. His head drooped forward, strands of dark hair sticking to his damp forehead, the left side of his face swollen and angry beneath a purpling bruise. Dried blood crusted at the edge of his mouth, and his breath came shallow, each inhale dragging fire across his fractured ribs. His shirt clung to him, damp and stained with sweat and grime, the faint metallic tang of his own blood lingering at the back of his throat. Across the table, Lieutenant Garrett sat like a blade waiting to strike. His elbows rested on the surface, his eyes fixed on Silas with predatory calm. The harsh angles of his armored shoulders cast jagged shadows against the wall behind him. His knuckles rapped against the steel table, slow, methodical beats that punctuated the silence like gunfire in the dark. "You're wasting my time, Kane." Silas didn't respond. He kept his breathing even, though each pulse of pain in his ribs screamed for attention. The cracked rib beneath his skin throbbed relentlessly, the memory of Eric's last blow still fresh and seething. Garrett's eyes narrowed, the lines around his mouth hardening. "You were coming from White City's direction. Nobody survives out there by accident." Silas slowly lifted his head just enough to meet Garrett's stare with his good eye, the other swollen shut beneath a darkening bruise. His expression betrayed nothing, flat, cold, unreadable. In the corner, Eric shifted restlessly, leaning against the wall with his rifle slung lazily across his back. The younger guard's eyes flicked between Garrett and Silas, filled with the jittery energy of someone itching for action. "He's playing us. Let me loosen him up." Before Garrett could answer, the heavy door creaked open, and Orianthe stepped inside, her boots clicking softly against the concrete floor. She was tall, with lean muscle beneath fitted armor, and a quiet authority that made the room feel colder. Her hair, tied back in a tight braid, glinted silver at the edges despite her youth. "Still at it, Eric?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged like tempered steel. "I told you to hold off until I got here." Eric's grin faded slightly. "We were just warming him up." Orianthe crossed the room in measured steps, standing between Garrett and Silas. Her sharp eyes scanned Silas, lingering on the bruises blooming across his ribs and the blood trickling down his chin. "He's not going anywhere," she said, coolly. "No point breaking him to pieces if we still need answers." Garrett gave a small nod but didn't look pleased. "You know how this works, Ori. Men like him don't crack with words alone." She met his gaze without blinking. "They do if you know how to ask the right questions." Silas exhaled, watching the subtle power shift. He recognized the kind of control she wielded, not with brute force like Eric, but with precision, keeping the worst instincts of men like Garrett in check. Eric rolled his shoulders, stepping back. "Fine, but you're holding us up. Good. He's worth more alive than dead," she replied flatly. Her eyes narrowed as she turned back to Garrett. "Or do you want to explain to the boss why Kane's a corpse before we know if he's a spy?" Garrett's mouth twisted into a scowl, but he relented with a sigh. "We'll do it your way. For now." Eric lingered by the wall, flexing his fingers. "We could use the serum," he suggested, his voice light but edged with something darker. "No man keeps secrets after a dose of that." Garrett shook his head. "Not yet. Too easy. A man like Kane needs to stew. Truth serum works, but fear lasts longer." Or, Eric added, glancing at Orianthe, "We let the boys in the barracks have a turn." Her stare hardened. "That's not happening." Garrett raised a hand. "I said not yet. He's no use to us if he's broken beyond repair. Give him 3 days. No food, no water." Orianthe gave Silas a final glance, and for a fleeting second, he thought he saw something beneath the steel mask, a flicker of empathy quickly buried. 3 days without food is a long time, Orianthe said, her tone quieter now. A man can lose his mind before he loses his tongue. I've seen it happen. Garrett leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. You worried about him, or about what he might know? Orianthi's expression didn't waver. I'm worried about wasting resources. We can't afford to ruin what might be valuable. Eric laughed under his breath. Soft spot, huh? You're wasting breath, Ori. Her gaze flicked to Eric, freezing him in place. I'm wasting nothing, but you might be wasting Kane's life with your heavy hands. If he dies, I'll make sure the boss knows why. Silas closed his eyes, listening to the faint hum of tension that filled the room. Even in pain, he could tell, Orianthi's word carried weight, more than Eric's bravado or Garrett's need for control. She wasn't just a guard. She was the one keeping them all from slipping too far. The door groaned as Eric retrieved his rifle, casting one last glance over his shoulder. The heavy slab slammed shut, leaving Silas alone in the stillness, listening to the hum of the flickering light and the faint rasp of his shallow breaths. Rumors whispered of White City drifted through the interrogation like a phantom. It was said that no one left the city once they entered, and those who approached its towering walls disappeared without a trace. Garrett's paranoia wasn't without reason. White City wasn't just a place. It was a threat. Orianthi watched the door close behind Eric, the clang of metal echoing in the silence. Her eyes shifted back to Silas, assessing him with an intensity that pierced through his stoic facade. She took a step closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. Silas met her gaze, unflinching despite the pain gnawing at his body. She stopped just within arm's reach, close enough for him to see the fine lines of experience etched into her face, barely visible beneath the harsh light. Silas, she murmured, her voice low enough that only he could hear. I can keep them off you for a while. He didn't react, but she saw the flicker of acknowledgement in his eyes. But you still have to answer the question sooner or later, she continued, her tone carrying a mix of warning and something almost like understanding. Silas's lips tightened, a silent refusal. He'd been through worse and had no intention of breaking now. But Orianthi's proximity brought an unexpected sensation, a strange, electric chemistry that neither fully understood but both could feel. Her breath was warm against his skin as she leaned closer. You're tougher than they think, she whispered. But toughness only goes so far. Silas held her gaze, sensing layers behind her words, experience, perhaps loss. He wondered how much she had seen and what had hardened her resolve yet kept a core of empathy intact. For a moment, their eyes locked in silent communication, a tenuous thread connecting them amidst the bleakness. It was a chemistry forged not by attraction but by mutual recognition, warriors who understood the unspoken rules of survival. Orianthi straightened, stepping back but not breaking eye contact. The flicker of empathy returned, more visible now but still controlled. She wasn't offering salvation, she was offering time, a precious commodity in their brutal world. I'll buy you what time I can, she said quietly. Use it wisely. Silas gave a small nod, acknowledging her effort without words. The room seemed to grow colder as Orianthi turned away, the brief moment of connection dissolving into the reality of their situation. As she walked toward the door, Silas couldn't help but feel a spark of something unfamiliar, a glimmer of hope or perhaps just a sliver of respect for the woman who balanced on the knife edge between duty and compassion. Orianthi's boots clattered on the concrete floor as she exited the cell. Marcus, the chief of security, followed closely, his weathered face contorted in anger. He seized her arm, pulling her to face him in the dimly lit corridor. What the hell was that? His fingers dug into her armor. Getting chummy with the prisoner, Orianthi's silver-threaded braid glinted in the light as she jerked her arm free. Her eyes narrowed, mirroring his intensity. Take your hand off me. The steel in her voice made him step back. You want answers? You won't get them by breaking him. Marcus's face turned red. So you do have a soft spot for him. Is that it? I have a soft spot for results. She squared her shoulders, her height advantage making him look up. You've been at this how long? 20 years? And how many prisoners have you lost to overzealous questioning? He crossed his arms, jaw tight. You're playing with fire, Ori. Do you even know what you're doing? A cold smile spread across her face. More than you think. I've broken tougher men than him, without leaving a mark. She leaned in, her voice lowering. The difference is, mine lived to talk. The room was cold, but sweat trickled down Silas Kane's temple as he leaned back in the rusted metal chair, his wrists bound tightly behind him. The flickering light overhead buzzed faintly, a dull reminder that silence rarely lasted long in Fraction X's interrogation rooms. Beyond the cracked window, the shadow of the White City loomed over the horizon, visible even through the grime-streaked glass. Lieutenant Garrett paced the room, his boots echoing sharply against the concrete floor. I don't like when people lie to me, Kane, he said, pausing to stare at Silas. You came from the White City's direction. Nobody just walks by that place without reason. Silas's eyes drifted toward the window. Even shackled, his gaze carried weight. The White City was always there, bleeding pale light across the wasteland as if mocking those left to rot outside its walls. His chest tightened at the sight, memories clawing their way forward, unbidden and unwelcome. You think I got inside? Silas's voice was hoarse, but there was steel behind it. No one gets in, you know that. Garrett's lips curled into a thin smile. Funny thing is, I think you did. And I think you know something about those walls the rest of us don't. Silas said nothing. He let the silence sit between them, cold and heavy. But Garrett wasn't the kind of man to enjoy silence for long. Garrett straightened, stepping back from the table. He studied Silas with a mixture of amusement and curiosity, as if trying to decipher a puzzle he already knew was missing pieces. I think you're lying, Garrett said. But that's fine. We have time. Silas shifted his gaze to the window once more. The White City stared back, distant yet suffocating. Whatever Garrett thought he knew didn't matter. The city had taken enough from Silas already. As Garrett exited the room, the door clanging shut behind him, Silas let his head drop back against the chair. The cold from the metal seeped into his skin, but it wasn't enough to keep the memories at bay. Outside, the White City's pale glow stretched across the horizon, indifferent to the men who fought and died beneath its gaze.
Silas woke the way he always woke now, already holding his breath. The room was the same, concrete, oil, rust. A single bulb swinging like a slow pendulum. The ropes biting into his wrists. The metal chair cold under him. But for a moment, just a moment, he wasn't here. He was back at the wall. Not the stories people told about White City. Not the whispered myths that made men brave at campfires. The real thing. The light. It wasn't bright like fire. It wasn't clean like sun. It was flat, a pale, steady glow that didn't come from anywhere and didn't behave like light should. It didn't cast shadows properly. It didn't warm anything. It just watched. Silas remembered the way the wasteland changed as you got close. The wind stopped carrying sand. Sound fell away. Even his footsteps had sounded wrong, too loud, too close, like the ground was listening for them. And the wall. People called it a wall because their minds needed a word. But it wasn't stone. It wasn't metal. It wasn't glass. It looked like all three at once, layered in a way that made his eyes refuse to focus. Like the surface couldn't decide what it was in the same instant it was being looked at. He'd pressed a hand to it. It hadn't felt cold. It hadn't felt warm. It had felt like nothing. As if the wall didn't recognize the concept of touch. And then, this part always came back sharper than everything else. A sound. Not a voice. A tone, low and steady, like a distant machine humming through bone. It had vibrated the air around him. Not loud, precise. Measured. Like it was taking a reading. He turned. And seen a silhouette on the other side of the glow. Not a person. Not a guard. A shape that stood still and somehow still felt like motion. Silas had blinked, and the shape had been closer. No footsteps. No movement. Just closer. His heart had tried to climb out of his throat. He'd stumbled backward, hand reaching for his weapon, body reacting before thought could catch up. And the tone had shifted. Higher. Slightly. Like adjustment. Like recalibration. Silas remembered thinking, very calmly, very clearly. It knows I'm here. Then his memory broke into pieces. A blur of pale light. A pressure behind his eyes. A moment where time felt thin, stretched, incorrect. And the last thing he remembered before waking in the wasteland days later was the wall doing something a wall should never do. It had opened. Not with a seam. Not with a door. The surface had simply yielded, as if reality had been asked to step aside. Silas breathed out slowly in the interrogation room, chest tight, ribs screaming. He forced his eyes open. The bulb swung. The ropes held. The concrete stank. But the light, pale and flat, still lived behind his eyes. And no matter what Garrett thought he knew, Silas knew one thing for sure. White City hadn't let him go. White City had let him leave.
The dim light flickered again, casting long shadows over the room as Silas shifted against the ropes binding his wrists. His muscles ached from hours of confinement, but his mind stayed sharp, counting every second Garrett was gone. He tested the ropes quietly, feeling for weaknesses. The knot wasn't perfect. Eric, the younger guard, had tied it in a rush after the last interrogation session. Silas twisted his wrists, feeling the coarse fibers loosen slightly. His eyes flicked to the cracked window. Beyond it, the White City loomed like a ghost, but it wasn't the city he feared now. It was Garrett. And he knew Garrett would return soon, angrier and less patient. Footsteps echoed faintly from the hall. Silas froze, breath held. The guard outside the door shifted but didn't enter. Eric. Too green for this line of work. Silas worked quickly. With one last tug, the rope slipped free, and he pulled his arms forward, rubbing feeling back into his wrists. He stood, muscles groaning in protest. The lock on the door rattled. Silas pressed himself against the wall beside the frame, heart pounding but his expression calm. The door creaked open. Eric stepped inside, rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. Silas struck fast, one hand closing around the barrel of Eric's rifle, the other smashing into his throat. Eric choked, eyes wide with panic as he crumpled to the floor. Silas knelt, easing the rifle from Eric's hands. He didn't need to kill the kid, just get out. He slipped into the hallway, rifle in hand, keeping low as he followed the sound of distant voices. The compound was quiet, most of Fraction X settling down for the night. Silas passed through the armory, spotting a jeep near the outer gate, crates of ammunition strapped to its sides. Perfect. Garrett's voice carried from deeper within the compound. Silas didn't wait to hear more. He climbed into the jeep, fired the engine, and tore through the perimeter fence as alarms blared behind him. Silas drove for hours under the fading sun, the jeep rattling over cracked earth and scattered debris. The vehicle groaned with each bump, but Silas pressed on, eyes fixed on the horizon. His thoughts stayed focused on the mission: escape, survive, find answers. The stronghold shrank in the rearview mirror, replaced by the vast emptiness of the wasteland. Wind whipped dust into swirling clouds, and silence fell heavy, broken only by the jeep's engine and the crunch of gravel beneath its tires. He glanced at the gas gauge. Running low. He had to make it count. As dusk approached, he spotted movement ahead, dark shapes flickering against the pale sky. Silas slowed, peering through the grime-streaked windshield. It wasn't until he got closer that he saw it: Rustbrook. The village looked like a patchwork quilt stitched from rusted metal and weathered wood. Makeshift defenses, barbed wire fences and rickety watchtowers, encircled it like a protective cocoon. Smoke rose lazily from a few chimneys, mingling with the evening air. Silas knew Rustbrook's reputation for turning away strangers. Rolling into the village in a stolen jeep loaded with ammunition would get him shot on sight. He needed a different approach. He veered off the road, steering the jeep into a dense thicket a few miles from the settlement. The vehicle bumped and jolted as it left the beaten path, its tires crunching over dry brush and snapping twigs. Silas parked in the shade of a massive, gnarled tree. He killed the engine and climbed out, muscles aching from the long drive. The smell of gasoline mingled with the earthy scent of dried leaves and sunbaked soil. He grabbed an armful of brush and began covering the Jeep, working quickly but meticulously. Dry branches scratched at his arms, but he ignored them, focused on concealing his presence. He made sure to hide the crates of ammunition particularly well. If anyone stumbled upon the Jeep, he lingered for a moment, tightening the strap of his rifle. With a glance toward Rustbrook's gates shimmering in the distance, Silas began the walk into town, footsteps crunching softly over the barren soil. The landscape stretched out before him, a wasteland of dry grass and scattered debris. Every step felt like a test of his endurance, each one a reminder of his need to stay alert. The rifle's weight on his back was a constant companion, both reassuring and burdening. As he neared the outskirts, he slowed his pace. Makeshift defenses became clearer. Rusted barbed wire strung between metal poles, scrap metal barriers cobbled together with skill born of necessity. Silas noted the watchtowers, 3 in total, each manned by a vigilant guard scanning the horizon. They didn't miss much in this place. Silas approached with measured caution, hands visible and empty to avoid any misunderstandings. He felt eyes on him long before he reached shouting distance of the gate. "Halt!" a voice called from above. "State your business." Silas stopped and raised his hand slightly. "Looking for refuge," he called back, voice steady despite the tension knotting in his gut. A pause followed, filled with the low hum of wind through metal and distant murmurs from within the village. Finally, another voice chimed in, a woman this time. "Name?" "Silas Kane." The guards exchanged glances before one disappeared from view. Silas could hear muffled conversation but couldn't make out any words. The waiting felt like another interrogation room, only without the walls pressing in. Minutes passed before the gate creaked open just enough to allow one person through. A figure stepped out, tall, lean, wearing a patchwork uniform that had seen better days. "You come unarmed?" the woman asked, her eyes sharp beneath a cap that shadowed her face. Silas nodded and unstrapped his rifle, setting it down slowly on the ground in front of him. "No trouble," he said simply. She glanced at it but didn't pick it up. "We'll see about that," she replied before motioning for him to follow her inside. As Silas walked through the gate, he took in Rustbrook's interior, narrow dirt paths winding between huts and shacks constructed from scavenged materials. People moved about their tasks with wary glances toward him. Strangers were always a gamble here. "Wait here," she ordered when they reached a small clearing near what looked like a central meeting area. Silas obeyed, standing still as villagers cast curious but guarded looks his way. His senses stayed sharp, cataloging exits and potential threats even as he waited for whatever judgment Rustbrook would pass on him next. Silas remained still, eyes scanning his surroundings. Villagers continued their work, some casting furtive glances his way. He could feel their curiosity and unease. An outsider represented uncertainty, possibly danger. Minutes ticked by. The sun bore down, its relentless heat amplifying the fatigue that had settled deep in his bones. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, resisting the urge to sit or lean against anything that might signal weakness. The door opened again, and a man emerged, broad-shouldered with graying hair and a face lined by years of hard decisions. His gaze met Silas's with an intensity that spoke of authority and experience. "Name's Tomas," he introduced himself, voice gruff but measured. "I run things around here." Silas nodded in acknowledgement. "Silas Kane." Tomas looked him over, assessing more than just the surface details. "Heard you're seeking refuge," he said finally. "That's right. And what brings you to our gates?" Silas considered his response carefully. "Needed a place to lay low," he answered truthfully enough without giving away more than necessary. Tomas studied him for another moment before nodding slightly. "We'll see about that," he said, echoing the woman's earlier words. He turned back toward the building and motioned for Silas to follow him inside. The woman fell into step beside them as they entered the dim interior of Rustbrook's central hub. A figure emerged from the shadows near the blacksmith's outpost, moving with a familiarity that set Silas on edge. The man wore a long, weather-beaten coat that brushed against his patchwork armor, the metal pieces clinking softly with each step. As he stepped into the light, his scruffy beard and sharp features became more visible, revealing a face that had seen its share of hardship. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the surroundings with a predator's gaze, assessing every detail with ruthless efficiency. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew the territory well, a fact that made Silas's muscles tense as he prepared for whatever might come next. Silas remained stoic, his eyes darting around the village, taking in every detail of Rustbrook's layout and defenses. The villagers eyed him with a mix of curiosity and suspicion, their movements cautious but determined. Silas's eyes narrowed as the man in the coat approached. The sharp green eyes and lean, weathered face triggered a flood of memories. Trapper Reed, an old companion from his army days, stood before him. The years hadn't dulled Trapper's edge, if anything, they'd honed it to a razor's sharpness. "Didn't expect to see you here," Trapper spoke, his voice gruff but tinged with curiosity. "You look like you've been through hell." Silas offered a slight nod, keeping his expression neutral. "Could say the same for you, Reed." Trapper let out a dry chuckle, glancing around the village. "Rustbrook's a far cry from our old stomping grounds. But it's home now." Silas scanned the settlement, noting the makeshift defenses and wary villagers. "Seems like you've managed to keep it standing." Trapper's eyes hardened slightly. "We've had our share of trouble. Raiders mostly, but we've held our own." He studied Silas for a moment before adding, "Why are you really here, Kane?" Silas hesitated. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. "Just looking for a place to lay low." Trapper's gaze didn't waver. "This place doesn't take kindly to strangers who bring trouble." "Not planning on causing any," Silas replied evenly. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick with unspoken history and the weight of past battles. Finally, Trapper nodded. "All right then," he said, his tone grudgingly accepting. "Tomas will have final say on whether you stay or go. But if you're here to stir up anything—" "I'm not," Silas interrupted, meeting Trapper's gaze head-on. Another beat of silence passed before Trapper turned and motioned for Silas to follow him inside the main building where Tomas waited. As they walked side by side, Silas couldn't help but recall the countless missions they'd survived together, each one cementing a bond forged in fire and blood. But he kept those memories buried deep. This was not the time for sentimentality. Inside the main building, Tomas looked up from his maps as they entered. His gaze shifted from Trapper to Silas with an appraising look. "Tomas," Trapper began without preamble, "this is Silas Kane. We served together back in the day." Tomas raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for further explanation. "He needs a place to stay," Trapper continued. "I vouch for him." Tomas's expression remained guarded as he addressed Silas directly. "You'll have to earn your keep here like everyone else." "Understood," Silas replied simply. The village leader nodded once before turning back to his maps, signaling the end of their audience. As Silas followed Trapper out of the building, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate had thrown them together again for a reason. Though what that reason might be remained as murky as ever in this harsh new world they inhabited. The two men moved through the village, Trapper leading the way with a purposeful stride. Silas kept pace, his senses on high alert as they navigated the narrow pathways lined with makeshift homes and watchful eyes. Rustbrook was a patchwork of survival, a testament to the resilience of its people. Wooden barricades, reinforced with scavenged metal, stood as a first line of defense against the dangers of the wasteland. As they approached a larger structure at the center of the village, Silas noted the heightened security, guards armed with an array of weapons, their expressions hard and unyielding. Trapper exchanged brief nods with them before pushing open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the air was cooler, dimly lit by flickering lanterns. The room was sparsely furnished but functional, maps and charts spread across a large table dominated the space. 3 figures sat behind it, their expressions a mix of authority and wariness. Elders, Trapper began, his tone respectful yet firm. This is Silas Kane. He's got something you'll want to hear. The elders turned their gaze to Silas, their eyes sharp and assessing. An older woman with silver hair pulled back into a tight bun spoke first. "Welcome to Rustbrook, Mr. Kane," she said, her voice calm but commanding. "We've heard about your escape. We need to know why you've come here." Silas met her gaze head-on, unflinching. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said plainly. "I need refuge and I have information that might be valuable to you." Another elder leaned forward, his brow furrowed in thought. "Information about what?" The elder next to her, a man with a deeply lined face and piercing blue eyes, leaned forward slightly. "Information about what?" he asked, his tone skeptical yet intrigued. Silas took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "The White City," he said simply. "I've been there. I know its defenses." A murmur ran through the room as the elders exchanged glances. The mention of the White City held weight, a name that carried both hope and dread in equal measure. "Go on," the silver-haired elder urged, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied Silas. The third elder, a stout man with a thick beard and wary eyes, finally spoke up. "Why should we trust you?" he asked bluntly. "For all we know, you could be leading trouble right to our doorstep." Trapper shifted beside Silas, his expression unreadable. Silas glanced at him briefly before turning back to the elders. "I understand your caution," Silas said calmly. "But I have no reason to harm this village. I just need a place to lay low for a while." He paused, letting his words sink in. Silence settled over the room as the elders deliberated silently amongst themselves. The weight of their decision hung heavy in the air. Silas stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Fraction X is growing bolder. I barely escaped with my life. If they come this way, Rustbrook needs to be ready." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling like dust in the air. The elders exchanged wary glances, the gravity of the situation evident on their faces. The silver-haired elder's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Silas. "Fraction X? We've heard rumors, but nothing concrete. What makes you so certain they'll come here?" Silas held her gaze, unflinching. "They're expanding their territory, pushing further every day. They want control, resources, anything they can get their hands on." He paused, letting the urgency seep into his tone. "Rustbrook's isolation won't protect you forever." The bearded elder leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "You expect us to take your word for it?" Silas nodded. "I've seen their camps, their numbers. They're not just scavengers anymore. They're organized and armed to the teeth." Trapper Reed shifted beside him, arms crossed as he listened intently. "He's right," Trapper finally said, his voice carrying a note of reluctant agreement. "I've seen signs of increased activity near the outskirts." The silver-haired elder glanced at Trapper before turning her attention back to Silas. "What do you propose?" "Fortify your defenses," Silas replied without hesitation. "Train your people for combat if you haven't already. Set up patrols and watch for any unusual activity." The blue-eyed elder spoke up, skepticism lacing his tone. "And what's in it for you?" Silas met his gaze evenly. "I need a place to lay low and regroup," he said simply. "If Rustbrook falls, I'm back out in the wasteland with no allies and nowhere to go." The elders fell into a hushed conversation amongst themselves, weighing Silas's words carefully. The atmosphere in the room was tense, each moment stretching longer than the last. Finally, the silver-haired elder turned to Trapper. "Ensure our defenses are reinforced immediately," she instructed. Trapper nodded and looked at Silas with a newfound respect in his eyes. "You'll have a place here," she continued, her voice resolute but cautious. "But we'll be watching you closely." Silas inclined his head in acknowledgement, understanding the unspoken trust he would need to earn. One of the elders, an older woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "And why would they come here?" "Because I escaped with more than just my life. I took their supplies and their pride. They'll want it back." The sharp-eyed elder's expression hardened, her gaze piercing through Silas. "You brought trouble to our doorstep." Silas met her eyes steadily. "Trouble was coming whether I led it here or not. But now you have a chance to prepare." The room buzzed with murmurs of concern and distrust. The silver-haired elder raised a hand to silence them, focusing on Silas. "What exactly did you take?" "Food, weapons, ammunition," Silas listed off. "Enough to slow them down, but not stop them. And their pride?" The bearded elder's voice was a low rumble. Silas's jaw tightened as he remembered the chaos of his escape. Silas took a breath, feeling the weight of their stares. "I took one of their armored vehicles. It's hidden outside Rustbrook, in a thicket." The elders exchanged glances, murmurs rippling through the room. Trapper Reed's eyes widened, and he leaned in closer. "An armored vehicle? Why didn't you bring it in?" Silas shifted slightly, mindful of the tension in the room. "Bringing it inside would have drawn attention. They're already looking for me, and an armored vehicle would be a beacon. I couldn't risk leading them straight here." The silver-haired elder nodded slowly, considering his words. "And this vehicle, it's functional, fully operational," Silas confirmed. "Loaded with supplies and ammunition. It's a valuable asset, but also a target." The blue-eyed elder shook his head slowly. "You've made them desperate. Desperate and angry," Silas agreed. "But also reckless." The silver-haired elder stood, her movements deliberate and calm despite the rising anxiety in the room. She looked around at her fellow elders before addressing Silas once more. "We'll fortify as you suggested and prepare for the worst." She turned to Trapper Reed. "Double the patrols and ensure every able-bodied villager is armed and ready." Trapper nodded, his face set in grim determination. The elders sat in thoughtful silence, the weight of Silas's words settling over the dimly lit hall. Trapper shifted his stance slightly, arms crossed as he watched the deliberation unfold. The air felt heavy, the crackle of the hearth the only sound in the room. Finally, Elder Miriam, the oldest among them, spoke. "If Fraction X truly believes you are their enemy, they won't let this go. But bringing conflict to Rustbrook isn't something we take lightly." Her voice carried a gravitas that commanded attention. The other elders nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Miriam's eyes moved to Silas, scrutinizing him with an intensity that seemed to weigh his very soul. "What assurance do we have that aiding you won't bring greater harm to us?" she continued, her tone even but firm. Silas stood his ground, meeting her gaze without flinching. "There are no assurances in a world like ours," he replied. "But I know their tactics. I can help you prepare." The blue-eyed elder leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And what if they come for you? Will you stay and fight with us or leave us to fend for ourselves?" "I stay," Silas said firmly. "I owe you that much for your hospitality." The room fell silent again as they considered his words. The bearded elder broke the quiet with a deep sigh. "We've survived this long by staying out of larger conflicts. This could change everything." Elder Miriam nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Silas's face. "And yet, we cannot ignore the threat at our doorstep." She turned to Trapper. "You trust him?" Trapper uncrossed his arms and stepped forward. "I've known Silas a long time. He's a man of his word." Miriam considered this before speaking again. "Very well. We will prepare as if war is upon us." She addressed the room, her voice carrying authority and resolve. "Let every villager know what we face and what's at stake." The elders murmured their agreement before standing to leave. Elder Miriam looked back at Silas one last time. "You have our trust for now, but remember our deal." Silas nodded solemnly as he watched them file out of the hall, the crackling hearth casting long shadows on the walls. Trapper clapped a hand on Silas's shoulder once they were alone. "Let's get started." With that, the elders dismissed him, and Trapper led him out of the hall. As they walked through Rustbrook, the villagers watched them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Trapper stopped outside a small cabin at the village's edge. "This will be your place for now," he said. Silas glanced around before stepping inside, appreciating the modest shelter from the harshness of the wasteland. "You've stirred things up," Trapper commented as he leaned against the doorframe. "It was necessary," Silas replied simply. Trapper nodded slowly before turning to leave. "Rest while you can. Tomorrow we start preparations." Silas watched him go before settling onto a rough-hewn cot in the corner of the cabin, exhaustion weighing heavy on his shoulders. For now, Rustbrook offered a momentary respite from the chaos that hunted him, but he knew it wouldn't last forever.